Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and welcome to the webinar titled Disaster Recovery and Business Continuity for Your Clinical and Safety Systems, presented by Perficient's Sean Bernard, who is a lead business consultant in the life sciences practice. For those of you who don't know, my name is Eugene Safanov, and I am the marketing manager for Perficient's life sciences practice. Before I turn it over to Sean, I'd like to cover some basic housekeeping items and then provide a brief overview of our company. So all participants on this call will be in listen-only mode, which means that everyone is on mute. You can submit questions to the speaker at any time today by typing them in the chat feature, which is located on the left side of your screen. Please do make sure you state your questions clearly, and keep in mind other webinar participants will not see your questions or comments. Your questions to the speaker will be anonymously addressed as time allows towards the end of the presentation. But if you still have unanswered questions after the webinar or would like to request information about our services, feel free to use the contact information provided in the presentation. You can also fill out the contact forms found on Perficient's website. This webinar is being recorded and it'll be sent to you within several days along with a link to the slides. Now that we've covered the logistics, let's move on to a quick overview of our company. Perficient is an IT consulting company that offers a whole host of IT solutions for a variety of industries, including, of course, life sciences, as well as financial services, consumer products, insurance, and a couple of others. We have employees in offices all over the world, including the many locations that you see on this map. And as you may expect, most of our clients are based in North America and Europe. This slide here contains a bunch of facts. Just to point out a few, we were founded in 1997. We're a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ. And lastly, at the moment, we have a little over 2,500 employees. So we offer our clients many different types of business and technology solutions, from business process management and information management all the way to content management systems and portals. We have a broad portfolio of solutions we work with. The services we provide are what you would expect from an IT services company, such as consulting, implementations and upgrades, cloud hosting, application support, project management, and so on. But when it comes to life sciences specific IT applications, we cover the data management and EDC space, safety and pharmacovigilance, clinical trial management, data warehousing, and analytics. That said, we provide services that relate to many other areas inside a typical life sciences company. All right, now that I've covered the housekeeping items, I'd now like to turn it over to Sean Bernard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. Again, my name is Sean Bernard, and I'm a lead business consultant with Perficient Life Sciences Computer Systems Validation Department. I've been involved in disaster recovery and business continuity for the better part of 15 years, with 7 of those being life sciences industry specific. Here you see our agenda. We'll start by talking about what the dangers are and why we're even talking about disaster recovery and business continuity. And then we'll look at what we mean by business continuity and disaster recovery and what the regulatory requirements for them are, if any. Next, we'll look at what a good BC program looks like, the various stages and deliverables are for those. And then we'll finish with some overall conclusions and enter into a Q&A session at the very end. So the world's a scary place, and the business world is probably even scarier. And specifically, I would argue that the life sciences industry, with its unique regulatory and patient safety requirements, is scarier still. Wow. So you probably wonder how scary. Well, let's take a look. This image depicts 178 weather and climate-related disasters that occurred between 1980 and 2014 that each resulted in more than $1 billion in losses. Any one of these events could have impacted the ability of the organizations within the affected areas to continue their business operations. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slide. There we go. This graphic shows a breakdown of the overall losses due to natural disasters in the U.S. in the same period, 1980 to 2014. You can see spikes here in 2005 for Hurricane Katrina, and again in 2012 for Hurricane Sandy. But you can also see that the overall losses annually have exceeded $25 billion for the past decade. This slide shows that cyber activity, one of the up-and-coming threats, is estimated to be as high, the losses from that is estimated to be as high as $120 billion annually, which this encompasses all sorts of cybercrime, including hacking, phishing, and that's phishing with a PH, as well as computer viruses and the damage that they cause. But to put it in perspective, it's only slightly lower than automobile crashes. So from this slide, it's apparent that cybercrime is not really a rare event. So if you take these three slides and put them together, they represent several of the threats to business, but by no means all of them. So here are some of the more generalized threats to basically encompass what most businesses are concerned with. We have computer system outages in all their various forms. This could be power outages, network downtime, server outages, failed services, etc. This is generally the realm of disaster recovery, but could also impact business continuity. And we'll talk more about that distinction in a few minutes. Criminal activity and hostilities is the next one. It involves crime, cybercrime, and armed conflict. Next one down is fires, whether they're natural or man-made. And we also have natural disasters, which would include hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, winter storms, etc. And these are pretty much all that we saw from that first slide with the map of the U.S. and all the different places that were affected by those. And then lastly, disease resulting in an epidemic or a pandemic. Again, some of these are strictly human-made threats, and others are natural, and some are made worse by human interactions. But in any case, they exist, and they have a very real ability to materialize and cause a disruption to business. So, with all these threats and all this information regarding the prevalence of threats around the world and even our own practical experience or information coming through the media, everyone must take business continuity and disaster recovery seriously. Well, the data shows that that's mostly true, but what we see is that, this is from a study done by AT&T regarding business continuity, and they asked U.S. business executives the question, which of the following statements best describes your business's approach to business continuity planning? Almost 20% said it was either not important, not a priority, or they didn't know if they had a business continuity program or plan. So while it's clear that most businesses take business continuity seriously, almost a fifth don't. And this is a pretty frightening statistic. It points to a huge gap in knowledge and preparedness among the leadership of many companies. So now that we know we need a business continuity, we need business continuity and disaster recovery, let's take a look at what that really means. So first, let's get some definitions down. Business continuity and disaster recovery can be defined in many ways, and each organization has its own way of defining it. These are two common definitions and the ones we'll use for the purposes of this discussion. So we'll draw the distinction by saying that business continuity is related to actions taken to protect critical business functions, and disaster recovery is the actions related to protect critical business IT systems. So that's the distinction we'll use. Business continuity is about our processes and functions, and disaster recovery is about IT systems. Keep in mind there are only two possible definitions, and there's a great variance in the degree to which individual organizations define BC and DR. What's important to know is that they both cover recovery of critical business functions and systems. So then we can talk about what the difference are between BC and DR. So this is basically reiterating what I've already said, but it's good to go over it again. So business continuity is about the survival of critical business functions. Disaster recovery is about the survival of critical IT systems. Since most critical business functions also rely on systems, then we can say that DR, disaster recovery, is frequently seen as a subset of business continuity, where business continuity is higher level and less technical, and DR is lower level and more technical. And an example might help. This is a lot of text, so I'm going to go through it for you. Basically, this is an example of XYZ Pharma Co. Inc. This is a fictitious company, but we're going to say they're a small pharmaceutical company, and they're located in Buffalo. They've defined clinical data acquisition as one of their critical business functions, and they have a data center in Buffalo equipped with IT systems, including OC and RDC. Site users from all over the northern New York area log into the systems to enter their study data. Any interruption in the operation of the systems would also interrupt the clinical data acquisition function. So in this case, because the systems and the function are linked, any interruption in the systems would cause an interruption in business in the function, so that we have both DR and BC would be impacted by that outage. However, the clinical data acquisition function could also be interrupted by a strong winter storm, which would preclude personnel and patients from being able to report to the site. And data acquisition would then not be possible. The IT systems are still intact and working perfectly, but the function is interrupted. This interruption would impact only business continuity. So that sort of illustrates the distinction between business continuity and disaster recovery. So from that, we have some misconceptions that we probably need to dispel before we start in on how to implement business continuity and disaster recovery. One is that I have a disaster recovery plan, so I'm covered. Well, since we've already seen that DR only covers systems, BC is also necessary in order to cover those functions that may or may not require those systems. Next, business continuity is only for large organizations. That's also not true. Even small organizations can benefit from identifying those critical business functions that exist within their organization and identifying ways to protect them. Another misconception is, since we have multiple locations, we don't need to worry. This might assist with failover and things like that for disaster recovery. Or maybe you have alternate operations at different locations, but you still need to go through the process of analyzing what your critical business functions are. Without that, you won't be sure what you're recovering. And then the last one being regulations don't require me to have BC or DR, when in fact certain aspects of 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11 both require data protection, which we'll talk about a little bit more next. So here we'll look at the regulatory requirements around disaster recovery and business continuity. Um, 21 CFR Part 11, Subpart B, Section 11.10c makes it clear that clinical data must be protected during the retention period. You'll notice that this is for closed systems. A closed system is just FDA lingo for any system where access is controlled by persons who are responsible for the content of electronic records that are on the system. And clinical systems and safety systems would definitely fall within the category of closed systems. Also, through issued guidance, the FDA has made it clear that disaster recovery falls within the scope of 21 CFR Part 11. This specifically lists disaster recovery. And once again, also in Europe, Annex 11, Section 16 requires that systems can survive a disaster, meaning they can be recovered or continue to operate. Sorry, just give me a second. I've lost track here in the slide deck. All right. So strictly speaking, the regs could be interpreted to mean that disaster recovery is a regulatory requirement for clinical and safety systems, but business continuity is not. And strictly speaking, this is true, but there's a big but there. Business continuity should always be a business requirement. And we'll look at why this is next. In order to understand why you need a business continuity program, we must first look at what a business continuity program is. A BC program is the full life cycle for creating, testing, and maintaining a business continuity plan. This life cycle is necessary because business continuity plan must be modified over time to take into account changes in the way the organization operates and changes to its capabilities and threats. All levels of the business, especially senior management, need to get behind the business continuity program. The BC program integrates with and augments GXP, validation, and QA processes and procedures. And the BC program will ensure that the plans are updated frequently, because the only thing more dangerous than no plan at all is an outdated plan. You also need a BC program because systems alone do not operate your business. So your business really resides, we need a little pointer, at this intersection between systems, people, facilities, and functions. And any plan that does not take into account all of these four areas will not properly protect your business. Recovery also takes much longer and is much more expensive without a BC program in place. If you haven't analyzed your critical functions, you will probably miss some when a disaster strikes. And if your clients, if you have clients, they may want to know that their data and your company can survive a disaster. This graphic shows an illustration of what recovery looks like when you have a solid BC program in place. You have normal business operations going along, and then we strike a disaster. That lessens our ability to continue normal business operations. And then we activate the BCP and DRP shortly thereafter when we understand that a disaster has occurred. We then have our critical business functions come back up quickly, and then we can continue to operate the business because our critical business functions are now restored while we bring all the rest of the non-critical functions back up. It's important to understand that this is an orderly, planned, and tested recovery, which adds speed and makes it so that everyone in the process understands what's going on. This is a similar graphic which shows the same recovery operation without a business continuity plan. We have normal business operations until we arrive at the disaster. We then have reduced operations. Slowly, systems are brought back online, but since no analysis has been done to discover what the systems are which systems are truly critical and which are not, all critical systems will most likely not be available until the very end of the recovery period, which is much longer than it would be with the BC program in place. So we see that recovery in this instance will be slow, it will be labor intensive, and it will be unpredictable, and probably prone to a lot of rework where certain systems are brought up, certain functions are brought up, and then it's discovered that there's other issues surrounding that. Work has to be redone. So up to now, we've discussed why we must have a DR plan, procedure, because it's a regulatory requirement. We've discussed why we should have a BC program, because without it, we're not properly protecting our business. And we've talked about what a BC program is. So now we'll look at how to implement it. Basically, the implementation is broken down into several stages and deliverables. So we'll quickly go through those now. Oops, sorry. So first we have the analysis phase. And within this phase, we develop our business impact analysis, which will look at all the critical functions in our organization and talk about the issues around bringing those back or why they're critical. And then we have the next phase is the development phase, where we create the business continuity plan, a disaster recovery plan. We create our policies and procedures surrounding business continuity and disaster recovery, and then we create any forms, templates, or any other necessary documentation to support the BC and DR functions as well as testing. Next, we'll get into the implementation phase, where we'll approve these documents that we've created in development and release them for use within the organization, along with the policies, procedures, and guidelines and forms that were created to support them. Next, we'll enter into the testing phase, where we'll create a business continuity test plan and a DR test plan to execute to test and make sure that our BCP and DRP are functioning correctly. And then we'll generate, from that testing, we'll generate approved summary reports that detail what we've done in testing and whether we've achieved our success criteria. And then lastly, there's the maintenance phase, where we take the lessons learned from testing. We take any action items and we resolve them before feeding all of the information back into the system in the analysis phase. So as we said, the business continuity program starts with a thorough business impact analysis. It identifies what critical functions exist within the organization. It identifies information systems which support those critical business functions. It looks at the maximum allowable downtime and maximum allowable data loss, if any, for these systems. And then the impact of each of these critical functions on the organization should they go offline. And then finally, any assets or resources that we need to take into account for continuing the operation and the recovery of the systems should they go down. This process, this analysis must have buy-in from senior management. They must be an integral part of the process in order for it to be successful. It must be exhaustive. Otherwise, critical functions may get overlooked, or critical information systems that feed those functions might get overlooked. And then it must identify personnel and a champion who will take the lead, so to speak, in the creation of the business continuity program. After analysis, we enter the development phase, where we use the information that was gained from the business impact analysis to develop policies, procedures, and guidelines surrounding business continuity and disaster recovery. Those policies will define that the organization will have a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan, and what those plans will contain. It will describe when and how testing is to be conducted, along with any constraints and the acceptance criteria that says that testing is accurate and successful. And then the next thing is how testing will be summarized and reported. Usually this is in a summary report of some type. And then how the business continuity plan and disaster recovery plan will be maintained over time, how it will be reviewed and updated. So the next step there in development is to actually write the business continuity plan. And business continuity plans usually contain these following things. First, it would be a risk assessment to analyze the current threats to the business. It will also detail measures that the organization has taken to prepare for disaster, or in some cases, to prepare their systems for sorts of failover. So if there's, for instance, multiple servers that do the same job and they fail over one to the next, that would be taken into account as one of the things that we're doing to prepare for disaster. It lists critical business functions. So once we've determined what they are, we can now list them out. It details the procedures taken during a disaster to recover those critical business functions. It lists the personnel and other resources involved in BC activities. And finally, we need to make sure the BCP is flexible enough to handle unforeseen threats. So next we'll go into writing the disaster recovery plan, which once again is seen as a subset of the business continuity plan. And this is system specific, so it's very similar to the business continuity plan, but instead of addressing the business functions, it addresses IT systems. So we'll look at which IT systems are to be considered critical, and those are usually based on the functions that were identified in the BCP. It lists critical information systems and the services they provide. It describes measures taken to reduce data loss and to determine maximum data loss, if any. Some systems are so critical that zero data loss is expected, while others are specifically designed so that up to 4 hours or something of data loss could occur. And that's all spelled out within the DRP. Next, it details the procedures to be taken during a disaster to recover those critical information systems. It talks about the personnel and other resources involved in DR. And it lists contact information for approved vendors who provide materials and services for DR. This can be computer systems that might need to be purchased to replace other ones that are down, or it may be consulting services that might be needed to bring back specific applications that run on those servers. And then lastly, we'd create forms, templates, and documents that support BC and DR testing. These could be assessment forms for damages to facilities. It could be incident report forms to detail what occurred and what actions we've taken to address that disaster. And then any testing templates, test cases, protocols, things along those natures that would support the testing of the BCP and DRP. And then we move into the implementation phase. This is actually where we take all those policies, procedures, and guidelines. Oh, I'm sorry, did I back up? Okay, no, I didn't. We move into implementation, where we actually take those policies, procedures, and guidelines and release them. These will need to be approved or at least have buy-in from senior management as well as QA. They are released in accordance with your company's QMS, which QA people will understand. But basically, that just allows time for training before effective dates before they become active. In other words, you need to retain training records for all personnel with business continuity and disaster recovery responsibilities, and we need to release any forms, templates, testing documents that were created to support testing. Then we'll need to approve the disaster recovery plan and business continuity plan, basically using the same process as above, where we have to allow time for training before they become effective. And then we need to schedule testing of the BCP and DRP in accordance with those approved policies, procedures, and guidelines. Next, we enter the testing phase. This is where we schedule testing. And obviously that testing needs to be, once again, according to those policies and procedures and guidelines. We need to notify personnel that are going to be responsible for testing or have some part in testing of the testing schedule. And then we need to write the BC and DR test plans, which dictate the scope of testing, what critical functions and systems are to be recovered, the responsibilities, the test methodology we'll use, the deliverables, and what acceptance criteria will show that the test was successful. And generally, the scope of testing, you want to make sure you're not testing the same functions or the same systems every single year. You want to rotate those around to make sure that you're capturing all the data. Otherwise, you end up with 2 or 3 critical systems that work really great, and the rest have never been tested. So it's important to make sure you're rotating through those critical business functions and systems to make sure they can all be recovered. Next, we'll execute testing. The testers will gather any supporting evidence that comes out of testing. It could be screenshots or reports or completed forms, and those will all be reviewed by QA and signed off on, and then we'll write the business continuity and disaster recovery summary reports, which detail what testing occurred and the results of that testing, any deviations or issues that were encountered during testing, and it will state whether or not the acceptance criteria have been met. And the last phase is the maintenance phase. This is where we take the lessons learned from testing and we capture those, along with any action items that need to be addressed. What worked, what didn't, any gaps that were identified in the testing, and any discrepancies that were identified. We look at those and determine what needs to feed back into the analysis phase in order to make sure that it gets addressed addressed during the next cycle through this process. And finally, our procedures, and guidelines should state that we have reviews that occur of all the documentation surrounding the BC program. Typically, these are periodic reviews that occur at a specific time of the year. And while we're doing that, we want to review the business impact analysis, make sure that all of our critical functions are the same. And if not, then we need to identify the new ones. And we need to look at if our recovery timeframes might have increased or decreased. So through testing, we might have determined that we really can't do without a particular business process 4 hours. It needs to come up in 2 hours, so that will need to feed back into the analysis phase and be part of the business impact analysis. Next, we'll review and revise those policies, procedures, and guidelines that are involved in the BC program. Any changes in the business impact analysis might have an impact on those documents as well. And then we'll revise or review the BCP and DRP and look at if anything's changed and what those changes are and how they impact those two documents. And finally, we can schedule ad hoc reviews. I'm sorry, not schedule, but ad hoc reviews are reviews that occur off the cuff, so to speak, so outside of the periodic review schedule. This might be predicated by audit findings or changes either in threats or in personnel, but they're not scheduled. They just occur when a gap may be noticed. So through this process, we arrive here at our conclusions. Obviously, we know that, we now know anyway, that regulatory agencies require disaster recovery, but that a business continuity is really necessary in order to fully protect your business. We understand that a wide array of threats exist in the world, and without actually looking at them and analyzing them, it's difficult, if not impossible, to prepare for them. So if any of them do become a reality, our business would be unprepared if we hadn't taken a look at them. We also understand that everyone in the organization must recognize the value of protecting the business, and this is from the senior management on down. And then a BC program results in the creation of a BCP and DRP, which then must be reviewed and tested and maintained in order for it to remain accurate and for it to be timely and for it to have all the information it needs to have. And finally, the phases of the BCP program constitute a life cycle approach, which is a best practice for the creation, implementation, testing, and maintenance of the BCP and DRP. And with that, we've reached the end of the presentation. I'd like to hand it back to Eugene, who will see if there's any questions for me.
Perfect. Thank you, Sean. So right now we are at that time, so feel free to submit your questions via the chat box if you haven't already. We've already received several questions, so we'll go ahead and begin asking them as they are stated. Sean, if you want to follow along on the questions tab, that would be great. I'll just read out the question aloud. So the first question is, what do you think are business critical systems / functions and non-critical business functions?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, certainly it will depend on your organization and how your organization does business. That's the main focus of that business impact analysis you do up front, is identifying which are critical and which are not. So for instance, for some organizations, email might be a critical function, where as well as a critical system. Whereas in other organizations, they'll fall back to using the telephone or using even text messaging or something like that. But in general, those sorts of functions that are core to your business, basically something that you couldn't do business without. For instance, if you're manufacturing, medications, then you have that whole medication, the manufacturing process rather, it would be a critical business function. And then you'd have to identify what systems within that support that function. In other words, what critical systems are within that.
Great, thank you. So the next question is, may we have a copy of your presentation? Yes, we will be sending the presentation, the actual recording, and the slides within the next several days. You can also keep checking the website for the posted material. Okay, the next question, let's see. Thank you for this insightful session and some statistics at the beginning of the presentation. Out of those billions, trillion-dollar losses due to disasters, do you know how many of those companies had BCDR plans in place? Thanks.
Okay, well, we don't know for sure how many had BCDR in place at the time, but from that statistic that AT&T came up with, we know that about 20% were probably underprepared. So that's a pretty significant block of businesses within those affected areas, I would say.
Great. Next question. Do you consider the BC/DR should be part of the validation activities for IT systems?
Well, certainly I think if those IT systems are defined as critical, we certainly could consider BC and DR for those IT systems to be part of validation. I would also say that BC and DR always support GXP and validation, even when they're not considered part of it. So for instance, if your IT system is set up that it would is set up to automatically fail over to say an alternate data center, I would definitely say that that's part of validation activities, and you should probably test that, the system's ability to actually do that.
Great. Next question. Regarding testing, is it expected that a separate team will be formed to execute production functionality via a manual process or alternative system? If so, how long is a reasonable time frame?
Interesting. Well, so what you're saying then is, let me see if I understand it. So a separate team will be formed. It's not necessary to form a separate team, I wouldn't say. You should schedule your business continuity and disaster recovery testing so that a different team member, say, would not be available during testing to simulate their absence, or inability to communicate during an actual outage. So, for instance, if you have IT people and they don't share knowledge across them, it would be easy to uncover that by taking one of them out of the equation. But as far as replacing automated processes with manual processes in order to overcome a disaster situation, that would all need to be identified within your business impact analysis and within your business continuity and disaster recovery plans. And a reasonable time frame would need to be ascertained from that. So in other words, if you do a business impact analysis and identify these processes and say you can fail them over to a manual process at an alternate location, you'd need to identify how long that process can be down before significant impact would occur, and if that manual failover could happen fast enough.
All right, perfect. Next question is, who's part of the implementation team?
The implementation team is going to be a group of people probably in QA and in the business group, mainly because implementation involves getting the documents that were prepared during development, getting those approved and distributed and training occurs. So the implementation team will probably, in most organizations, come out of QA.
Okay, thank you. The next question is it's coming from a pharmacovigilance perspective. Do we need individual BCP documents for each critical function as per the industry best practices?
For each critical business function, I would say no. If you have critical business functions that are spread over a wide area, wide geographical area, you may need multiple business continuity plans to cover those, to cover the threats and the disasters that could occur in those distributed geographical areas. But I wouldn't say you'd need one for each individual process. A single BCP can, address multiple processes or functions, I should say.
Perfect, thank you. Next question is, should IT take the lead for BC or should they support the business? Essentially, who owns BC?
Typically, I would say that in most organizations of any size, smaller organizations are going to have it a little bit more difficult time to assign resources specifically to BC or DR. Once again, for our purposes in this discussion today, we considered that BC would be a business function and that DR would be for IT systems. So an organization large enough, I would say that the BC plan should definitely fall within the business unit and the DRP should fall within IT.
Perfect. All right, so that's all we have for the questions at the moment. It looks like we're getting a few more here, so let's answer that one. We see paperless office trend growing. What are some effective measures for BC for a company?
Okay. Well, I would say, obviously, the paperless office trend increases our reliance on information systems. We have document management systems. We have electronic signature platforms. All of these things are systems which support many critical business functions, I would say, or several critical business functions. So with that in mind, I would say that BC wouldn't be as affected as much as IT. So in other words, I think those systems would have to be identified as critical and would fall under the disaster recovery plan. But obviously, those sorts of things would come out of the business impact analysis as well.
Perfect. Next question. How often should you test your DR and BC plans?
Well, you should test them at least annually, or it really depends on your organization. Most organizations, I feel, would probably benefit from an annual test, and obviously whenever you do a review cycle, so if you have an ad hoc review, it might be beneficial to schedule testing shortly thereafter to make sure that the changes that you've made through the review cycle are successful and then can be tested. But I would say annually is probably a best practice.
Perfect. All right, let's see if we have any more coming in. Yes. For managing approved vendor, what impact do SaaS and cloud-based solutions impact BC?
Well, certainly cloud-based solutions would feed into IT systems. It would fall under DRP. The issue being that you've completely outsourced that, whereas cloud solutions work wonderfully because the systems are distributed over a wide range of areas, so that all needs to be taken into account when looking at threats that could occur, and certainly would provide a great deal of mitigation of those threats, so that, for instance, if you're using SaaS or if you're using Salesforce and it's in the cloud, one incident at one data center would not affect the overall operation of that critical business function. So obviously that provides a lot of, as I said, mitigation for any threats that could occur to that particular critical business function. So short answer is that cloud-based solutions provide a lot of sort of cushion so that you don't really have to worry about it too much. But granted, it's completely outside your hands when it's in a cloud solution. So you have to interact directly with the vendor to see exactly, how that would impact your business and what it would take to bring those services down.
Okay. So at this point, I don't see any more questions. We'll give it another few seconds to see if anything else comes in, considering we have a few more minutes left on the clock. Okay. So if you do have other questions, you are welcome. Looks like we have a few more questions that just came in. So let's go ahead and answer this since we have more time. So I think that a risk-based approach should be conducted in each company to define what is really critical and what is not. In pharma, I think there are a couple of systems and functions, such as safety database, data for drug substance and animal. Okay, so I'm not even sure that's a question. I think that's more of a comment.
In one respect, I would agree with that. That you have to define what critical really means to your company as well. I would argue that there are more than 3 systems, even for a pharma company. I would probably say that, for instance, payroll would be a critical business function. I know we have dedicated employees, but if you stopped paying them for several weeks, some of them might decide they need to go somewhere else, and you'd lose, a lot of your creative intelligence in the organization. So it really needs to, you really do need to do a risk-based approach, which is once again in that business impact analysis, and say that what is truly critical for the organization, and not just look at line of business type functions, but also in the greater scheme, in the larger organization.
Perfect. Thanks, Sean. That person was asking for your opinion, so thanks for answering that.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, we'll just ask one more question since we're coming up close to the hour. Who should approve a disaster recovery plan? Does senior management have to approve it?
Certainly, senior management should be involved in BCP and in the business continuity plan. Disaster recovery plan, I feel that senior management should also be involved in that. These are documents which describe exactly how the organization will recover from a disaster, and senior management needs to indicate that they're aware that they've looked at these procedures and that they agree with them. So that's why I think approval should be done on the BCP as well as the DRP from senior management.
Perfect. Thank you. So that wraps up our Q&A portion. If you do have additional questions, you are always welcome to email us. You can email Sean directly. You can email our sales email address. You're welcome to call us, fill out a contact form. Any way you'd like, feel free to email us your questions. Again, we are going to send you the recording of the webinar as well as the slides in the next few days. Stay tuned for that. I'd like to mention that we have a few more webinars that are currently scheduled. They are on our website, and you are welcome to register for them. Off the top of my head, we have a HIPAA compliance one and how it relates to pharmacovigilance. That's coming up. We have a CTMS webinar that relates to the top 5 enhancements that many companies request frequently. And just today we put up our new webinar that will focus on decoding 21 CFR Part 11, which is based off our blog series that is currently going on. Again, thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Sean, and we look forward to having you join future webinars. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day and evening.